So today we're going to be doing extra history. Khosrau Anushirawan. That one I'm gonna actually have to hear him say again because I don't know how to pronounce that one. I know going into this that this is related to the Byzantines. Somebody said earlier in the chat that, like, I hope you remember some stuff from the Justinian episode, which I remember some stuff from the Justinian episode, but we'll see how much I remember. I hope it's a decent amount. And I like the idea of taking on something that takes on similar subjects but a different perspective. That's always interesting. As far as Khosrau goes, I don't know a ton about him, like, independently of any sort of mention that may have occurred in the Byzantine stuff, but if so, like, I still don't really remember a ton about him as well. The Justinian episode, not the Byzantine. Justinian is like synonymous with the Byzantine Empire for me, that like I just swapped them in my head. All right, whatever. Let's get started with the first one and we'll see where it takes us. Go.
To tell the story of Khosrau Anushirawan, ruler of a golden age, we first have to understand his father, Kavad. Kavad ruled the great empire of Iran. The West called it Persia, and he saw that empire brought to the brink of collapse. And boy oh boy, did he not enjoy that experience. Prince Kavad spent his childhood like most young boys do, held hostage by his father's greatest enemy. His captors were the Hephthalites, a Central Asian tribe that had pushed their way up to the borders of Iran. They were new, they were powerful, and they had made the Iranians very, very nervous. Their relationship had started so well, though. They had helped Kavad's father win his throne, they had fought at his side in a couple of wars, but then they got into an argument over who controlled a town on their shared border. Naturally, Kavad's...
So we've talked about many cases of the children of great leaders being held hostage, and it's always a fun conversation to have because I love to see how much they actually mean. If it really is like the intended successor, it's a problem, but I've seen some cases where the captured family member does not actually provide the other side with a whole lot of leverage. I'd imagine in this case we have some real leverage here.
Father had gone to war over it, and he had lost. He had lost so badly that the Hephthalites actually took him captive, and he'd had to pay his own ransom just so he could go back to ruling Iran again.
Jeez,
he was a little testy about that, and so of course he went to war with them a second time, and he lost again. This time, he was forced to give them Kavad as a hostage, because surely he wouldn't attack them again if they held his son. He did, though. I mean, the third time's the charm, right? And he didn't get captured this time. He got killed, along with the rest of the Iranian army. The Hephthalites pushed forward, and the Iranians were in a panic. Kavad's uncle had been put on the throne, but man, he did not know what to do. Enter Sukra, a minister to the former Shah and leader of a powerful...
So, if his uncle is on the throne, does he have, like, I gotta think, like, does he actually have the motivation to rescue him? If he's out of the picture. If this is, like, anything like a normal succession, like people are backstabbing snakes, and getting the kid out of the line of succession would secure like his legitimacy a little bit more. Like, as long as the kid's still there, he's kind of the rightful heir. I would assume. I don't know. I don't remember exactly how Byzantine succession worked. I think it can be a little bit messy, so I don't know. What I'm basing this off of may be more of a like a different system of succession, and maybe it's not fair to compare them, but I don't know. It's all the only lens I have is my own and what little knowledge I have.
powerful noble family. He took command of the army and managed to stop the Hephthalite advance. Sukra then negotiated the terms of a new truce, agreeing to pay a heavy tribute in exchange for peace and the return of all Iranian property, including the dead Shah's son, Kavad. Sukra returned home a hero. People celebrated him in the streets. But Kavad wasn't so lucky. Though he was the previous Shah's son, the noble families of Iran decided to elect Kavad's uncle as the new Shah. After all, how could they trust this boy who had just—
Sorry, I already got it messed up because I called them the Byzantines. The Byzantines are going to be the opposite side in this. We're talking about Persia. Sorry, I got caught up in it again. Like, I'm getting things mixed up way too early in this. We're talking about Persia / would be Iran. Okay, there we go. Don't wanna get like all my wires crossed too early. So yeah, I don't know what their actual system of succession is, so this is important.
Just spent years as a prisoner of the enemy. One noble even wanted to see Kavad executed, but Sukra, who had just gone to all this trouble rescuing the kid, managed to convince the nobles to merely imprison Kavad instead. So the poor kid got sent away yet again, this time to the Fortress of Oblivion. I am not kidding, that was the prison's actual name. Don't say history never gave you anything. Honestly, Kavad had been better off with the Hephthalites. Sure, he had been their prisoner, but they always treated him like more of a guest. And frankly, prisons don't earn names like Fortress of Oblivion for being comfortable. Somehow, though, Kavad managed to escape, and when he did, he ran right back to the Hephthalites. He promised them gold, and in return, they promised to help him win back his rightful throne. Thus, in 488 CE, Kavad marched to the capital at Ctesiphon with a sizable foreign army at his heels. This time, the nobles sided with him, as did Sukra. They deposed his uncle without a fight, and Kavad was confirmed as the new Shah. Sukra
Okay, so I know at least something about royal succession, because that more or less went how I thought it was gonna go. You can never— the uncles are so shady when it comes to royal succession. You can never try. When you have the opportunity to have the world, like, who would you be willing to betray? Like, pretty much anyone. Like, and most people are not principled enough to resist such a thing, so there we go.
Became his advisor and tutor, since the new Shah was still pretty young and had definitely not spent much time in Iran recently. At first, Kavad welcomed—
They weren't educating him in prison.
He eventually came to realize that his so-called advisor wanted him as a puppet, not a Shah. When people had problems in need of solving, they always brought those problems to Sukra, and when Kavad tried to weigh in with his own suggestions, everybody ignored him. He soon realized that the crown he wore and the throne he sat on were mere decoration. Sukra truly ruled this empire. Now, it is true that a handful of noble families had always been the real power behind the throne of Iran. It had been that way for centuries, but they were supposed to stay behind the throne. They each oversaw specific regions on the Shah's behalf, much like feudal lords. And while the locals might serve their noble families, those families were supposed to serve the Shah. It had worked this way for so long that the biggest—
I mean, there is definitely a practical element to having the Shah. Like, despite the fact that it feels like it's mostly symbolic, I went through a phase where I like downplayed the impacts of that sort of symbolism, but by having that central authority to sort of tie everything together, like it totally makes sense why you would want that. It keeps this from breaking down into a bunch of ruinous states feuding with one another, so like I kind of get it.
Noble families, like Sukra's, had been in power even longer than the Sasanian dynasty Kavad descended from. And yeah, the nobles had always meddled in royal affairs. Kavad's uncle was not the first Shah they had deposed, and he would not be the last, but the way Sukra was now holding—
Oh yeah, guys, there's like a 20-second delay for your messages to show up on screen. I see people are a little confused about it. It's like 20 seconds or so, roughly. Plus whatever sort of delay is there on your end. And anything faster than that would cause a lot of lagging on my end, and I would rather it be like smooth and easier for you to watch, and then it takes me an extra second to get what you're trying to say. However, I do get your messages a little bit faster on my phone, which is right here. So I see the most recent message a little bit before it actually shows up on screen. So sometimes I end up responding to things that aren't on screen yet. So I hope that clears up any confusion about that. I know that's kind of messy, but it's the best I can do.
Holding court and giving orders on the Shah's behalf? That was not done. After 5 years of struggling to assert control over his own advisor, Kavad ordered Sukra to leave the capital and go back to his home city. Sukra obeyed, but only because it put him out of the Shah's reach. From such a safe distance, he could brag openly about how Kavad wouldn't even have a throne if not for him. And even living away from the capital, he held all the power. The Empire's taxes were still brought to him. He still commanded the army. Kavad had nothing. The stars had aligned for Sukra. To all appearances, he stood on the brink of claiming the throne for himself. This is what Kavad had counted on. If he knew one thing about Iran's noble families, it was this. Through all the centuries of intrigue, manipulation, and outright bloodshed, the one thing that always served to keep noble families in check was their rivalry with other noble families. Now, with Sukra visibly rising to new heights of power, and openly bragging about it no less, his most bitter rivals took action. Egged on by Kavad, they gathered and raised their own army to march on Sukra's home. Soon, they deposited both Sukra and his vast treasury at Kavad's feet. The young Shah had eliminated the greatest threat to his reign while barely lifting a finger. Sukra...
So, he seems... Some leaders, like, despite him, like, being a little late on his education, a lot of leaders will be educated on how to do it from, like, the earliest possible point. But he's had massive delays in that. He's lived his life in prison. So, he must have, like, a natural instinct for it, because like there's no reason he should be able to outsmart this guy, given everything, how his life has gone thus far. It's very likely that he must have like just a knack for this, which very few leaders really have it like on that like legendary level. But I believe this guy is like compared to Justinian in some capacity, which Justinian, like him or not, and I don't really like him that much, but he had a knack for it.
Was executed and removed from the board, but Kavad was just getting started. Never again would he allow a noble family to rise against him the way Sukra just had. The nobles must be cut off at the knees. See, a new movement had been brewing in Iran ever since the death of Kavad's father. The threat of a Hephthalite invasion had sent a ripple of fear through the empire, and in that atmosphere, people had turned to new faiths with new answers. One priest in particular, named Mazdak, had split from the official tenets of Iran's Zoroastrian religion and begun preaching a new doctrine. Mazdak believed in peace, free love, and eating veggies. He was basically a 5th century hippie. And he argued for the complete redistribution.
So free love means you just kind of, if it means the same thing it does later on, it means you just kind of have sex with whoever you really feel like it. Like, don't be held back by the need to have like marital connections or whatever. Just do it, everybody. Everybody just get together and do it.
Of wealth and the peaceful elimination of entrenched upper-class nobility like Sukra. Kavad liked that last idea very much. So the Shah gave up meat, embraced free love, and became a Mazdakite. With Kavad's
that's
blessing,
weird.
Mazdak threw open the imperial granaries and began distributing food to the people. They also divided up land that had been held by the noble families for centuries, weakening noble control of the realm. For the first time in Kavad's reign, the people loved him. They sang his praise.
Dude, I wonder if like Marxists looked back on this guy, like the early like Russian revolutionaries ever looked at this guy, because there are some things they might find interesting about him as like a proto version of certain ideals that they may have held. I don't know, it's not a perfect comparison, but there is something very ahead of its time about the way that this guy is going about things. I'm not saying that it's necessarily good. I don't know how this is actually going to turn out, but his approach is, and it's cynical because it's to consolidate his own power. So this is not like this is clearly not just a principled stance here either.
Praises the way they used to sing Sukras for saving them from the Hephthalites. But both the nobility and the high-ranking priesthood, those powers which had stood behind the throne for centuries, hated him. Kavad had made a mistake. Maybe he thought he could restrain Mazdak's more ambitious ideas about equality, or maybe he thought that this popularity with the people would keep him safe. But he had reached too far, too fast. The nobles rose up against him, deposed him, and once again threw him into the Fortress of Oblivion. Boy, I love that name. They then put his younger brother on the throne to undo Mazdak's reforms and be their new puppet Shah. Alas, though the Fortress of Oblivion continued to have a very, very cool name, it also continued to be very, very bad at containing Kavad. Kavad escaped...
Like, I'm not getting what the big deal about this Fortress of Oblivion thing is, because he's never there long enough for them to emphasize, like, why it's so bad or whatever. It seems like it's getting kind of it's if you just look at it through his lens, it's kind of overrated, you know?
Once again, and fled to his old friends, the Hephthalites. I think it might be time to face the hard truth that the Fortress of Oblivion was just not a very good prison. Yes, I am disappointed too. The Hephthalites were just as happy to accept Kavad's money as last time, though, so once again he boldly marched up to Ctesiphon. His poor brother, who had never really been that into this whole Shah idea anyway, quickly stepped aside, and for the second time, Kavad became the Shah of Iran. But it's fair to say at this point that Kavad's reign had thus far been troubled. One disaster after another, really. And all of these upheavals had left the empire weak. The army was still under the fractured control of the noble families, and Iran's wealth was being sapped away year after year in costly tributes to appease the Hephthalites. And to top it off, Mazdak and his followers continued to push their aggressive social reforms forward, even after Kavad had tried to...
This guy's interesting. This guy himself, I think, deserves his own series, because I'm curious about this guy's ahead of his time in a way. That sort of level of, I was giving kind of the credit to the wrong person. Maybe he is would he be like a true egalitarian? It seems like he's doing it through centralized power, so perhaps not, but like what he is pushing is fundamentally more egalitarian than anything you're gonna find, which basically means closer to like true equality between people.
Ideals. Things did not look good for the K-Man, but he was undeterred. Kavad believed he could bring his empire back from the brink of ruin, but it would take a lifetime, perhaps even 2 lifetimes. Luckily, he might just have 2 lifetimes to work with. Just before he had been deposed, a new wife had given birth to his 3rd son. The boy was young, but Kavad saw potential in him. This child could be molded to carry on the legacy that Kavad now hoped to build. That boy's name was Khosrau.
Okay. I forgot who we were talking about. I forgot that the guy we were talking about was not actually our main figure, and that this was simply an introduction to get to the actual guy we were going to be talking about. Oh gosh. I was immersed in this guy's story, but we're about to move on. Okay, well, if it's half as interesting as the father, then I'm interested in the son, so we'll see.
Following his father's death, Kavad had staved off disaster time and again for the empire. But yearly peace tributes to the Hephthalites had left the Iranian treasury bare. Nothing was left to help the farmers who fed the empire. Without help, Kavad's people would soon starve. In desperation, he turned to his neighbors, the Eastern Roman Empire.
Oh. Okay, that's where we're going.
Despite countless generations of conflict between Rome and Iran,
the gate,
the 2 empires had been at peace for nearly a century. Nomadic tribes across the Caucasus Mountains to the north had forced them to agree on terms of mutual defense. Iran would guard the pass through the mountains, called the Caucasian Gates, so long as Rome sent money to help pay the soldiers. But the Romans had gotten kinda distracted. They were all like, we're kinda dealing with these other wars in the north right now, and also in the west. And wait, Ah, crap, the Ostrogoths just took Rome. Like, actual Rome. Oh, jeez. Can you guys handle the Northern Tribes thing while we... Hey, you guys give that back, I'm not kidding! So Rome had stopped paying for the northern defense. And since Iran had their own problems at the time, multiple wars with the Hephthalites and their king dying, followed by a decade of political turmoil, they weren't exactly in a position to press the issue. But now that Kavad had finally pulled his empire back together, now it was time to press. Kavad reached out to the Roman Emperor Anastasius and insisted that Rome pay its share.
Okay.
That would take...
That helps me know, like get a grasp of when things are. Anastasius is now we have kind of a marker for where things are. I forgot what year it was, but it lets me know whose reign we're in. I know a slight bit more about what the Romans are doing than what the Persians were doing at the time, so this feels a little better.
Take some of the strain off of Iran's treasury, so Kavad could subsidize his farmers and avoid a famine. But Anastasius replied, saying, well, we never technically signed an agreement or anything, so we're not going to pay you back. But hey, we can give you a loan. To which Kavad responded, I'll loan my fist to your face, and went to war. Now, waging war is generally not a good idea for empires on the brink of ruin, but Kavad really needed this one. Raiding food and supplies from the border cities of the Roman Empire solved his immediate problem of feeding his own empire. And
well, there is something interesting if you are successful in going to war in a time of desperation. Yeah, you pull the supplies from the other places. Alexander the Great, he abolished taxes and funded his empire through his empire's own conquests. So there is some precedent for this sort of stuff working out. It's just that the Persians don't seem to have a very good history with this stuff. They seem to like not be on the best streak of foreign conquest right now, so yeah.
It also solved his long-term problem of getting the Hephthalites off his back. As Iran's eastern neighbors, the Hephthalites very much enjoyed watching Iran go to war with the West. They liked it so much that they sent their own soldiers to join in the looting, which was actually pretty handy because the Hephthalites had wiped out the core of Iran's army 10 years ago. This war lasted only a few years, but it ended with Rome finally agreeing to pay tribute to Iran. Kavad had adopted the superior swords and bows of his Hephthalite allies, and built his broken army back into a power to be feared. But he had done so at the cost of reigniting Iran's age-old rivalry with Rome. The Romans now openly broke their prior treaty obligations. Both empires had previously agreed to stop building military fortifications on their shared border, as a gesture of good faith. But as soon as Kavad got distracted by Turkic tribes invading through the Caucasian gates, Anastasius bought every building in a small village called Dara and rapidly built it into a shoddy little fort. When Kavad turned back around and saw a fort where there had definitely not been a fort before, he asked, "Hey, did you put that fort there?" And Anastasius answered, That? No, that's always been there. Here, take some gold, go fight your Turks or whatever. Kavad did have his hands full with the whole Turk situation, and then beating up his former Hephthalite allies, so it took him a while to get back to this Rome issue. By the time he finally did, things had changed. Anastasius had died without declaring an heir. An upstart pig farmer named Justin had stepped into his place, although all reports indicated that his nephew Justinian was the real brains behind the throne. Still, it was a stark reminder.
Okay, now I'm sure this is what actually gets people paying attention. I know Justinian's very popular with the comments section, so this should be wonderful for everybody else. I think people are under the impression that I hate Justinian. I don't hate Justinian. I just don't generally like royalty of any kind.
Reminder to the aging Kavad that it was never too soon to choose an heir. The most obvious candidate was his eldest son, Kawus, who not only had seniority but currently served as a governor of a northern province. But Kawus was a fervent Mazdakite, and Kavad had spent years now trying to distance himself from that whole mess. His second son had lost an eye, which technically disqualified him under Iranian rules of succession. And then there was
Okay, so they fall under that as well. Okay, that's interesting. They've that is a thing. Depending on where you are, like if you have certain ailments, you would not qualify to be a leader. Like, I'm trying to think of the story of the it might have been in sometime in English history, maybe, where. I'm trying to remember exactly who it is. I think it was William the Conqueror's. No, it's not William the Conqueror. It's something around that time. Somebody got like stabbed in the eye and they lost an eye, and they also were not allowed to be the ruler because I don't know. You were supposed to be like, I don't know, pure in body or something, or I don't know what it is. Like if Franklin Roosevelt was gonna be a king, his polio would have disqualified him, and even he had to hide it, and it was technically not going to disqualify him, but like even he didn't want people to know about
Khosrau, his third son, his favorite, the one who had already made allies at court by denouncing the Mazdakites. Not a hard choice, actually. But the Mazdakites remained a problem. Even without Kavad's support, their goals of a classless society and equal distribution of wealth continued to win converts across the empire. They were still vastly outnumbered by followers of traditional Zoroastrianism, though, and a backlash eventually swelled against the Mazdakites and their radical ideas. Priests pushed to enforce official doctrine all across the empire, even in the border territories, which Iran had traditionally allowed to do their own thing. For many of those...
But guys, forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. That's one of my favorite Roger Williams quotes, sorry.
Those territories, doing their own thing meant being Christian. So having Zoroastrian doctrine suddenly in...
The last Anglo-Saxon's king's son. I'm glad everybody else has a better memory than I do. Because, I knew vaguely what I was talking about, and then I started talking, and I was like, oh wait, I don't remember who it actually was. I'm in over my head.
There we go. Did not go over very well. It all came to a head in 524 CE when one Iranian territory with a Christian king decided to defect to Rome. Kavad reached out to Justin to see if they could resolve this peacefully. Justin, buddy, hey, just a thought, maybe stop accepting our runaway territories into your empire and let's just be friends, okay? And hey, as a gesture of good faith to seal this friendship, I'll let you adopt Khosrau as your son. The adoption offer was mostly a formality. Khosrau was a grown man. He wasn't exactly gonna move to Constantinople and start calling Justin dad. But the gesture could bring the two empires together, and Roman support could help Khosrau claim the throne when Kavad died. In fact, the Iranians had done exactly the same thing for Rome in the 4th century, when a previous Shah had adopted the emperor's son to secure his succession. Kavad felt that it was high time Rome returned that favor. Justin loved this idea. His advisors did not love it as much. They worried that this symbolic gesture might be the first step of a sneaky campaign to place Khosrau on the throne of the Roman Empire. They suggested maybe tone it down a little. So ambassadors from both sides met on the border, with Khosrau himself waiting in the wings. The Romans said, great news, our emperor will adopt you, but not as a Roman and an equal son. No, he's already got one of those. But he will adopt you as a barbarian. To which Khosrau responded, he can adopt my fist to his face, and went to war. The war started out great for Iran. Kicking the Romans up and down the frontier felt just like old times. By now, though, Justin had died and left the empire in the hands of his ambitious nephew, who began an aggressive push to fortify more places along the border. The newly reinforced city of Dara, which Kavad always knew would be trouble, handed Iran their first major loss. In the peace negotiations that followed, Kavad insisted that the Romans pull down their fortifications at Dara and start paying their fair share to defend the Caucasian gates. He did not live to hear Justinian's response. Kavad passed away in 531 CE, leaving a will that declared Khosrau should inherit his throne. The nobles quickly voted to confirm.
What do you think? Do you think this is going to be smooth? I don't know for sure, like if there's going to be conflict with like siblings or whatever. It seems like this might actually be one of the rare cases where, oh, he dies, oh, we got the successor. That's it. There was no drama after that, but also, like, I'm a little hesitant to assume that things are gonna go well.
His choice.
Clearly he's gonna get it, but like, is there gonna be like something in the middle? We'll see.
And at last, it was Khosrau's time to shine. But all the problems from his father's reign hit Khosrau at
here
once.
we go.
A new wave of invaders poured through the Caucasian gates, and the Iranian army was still tied up in the war with Rome. Khosrau called on his brother Kawus, who still governed a province up north, to repel the invaders. Kawus took care of the problem quickly, but then claimed that his victory proved that maybe he should be Shah instead of Khosrau.
There we go.
Since Kawus was a Mazdakite,
Didn't take long.
And his followers immediately joined his cause. Khosrau needed his army back, which meant he needed to make peace with Justinian and recall the army from the borders of Rome. He invited Justinian's envoys into his court, but the envoys replied that they would not negotiate anything. Justinian had caught wind of Kawus's rebellion and hoped to sow as much chaos into Iran as he could. So, he refused to recognize Khosrau as the new Shah. Kawus came to Ctesiphon to press his claim to the throne, and Khosrau watched his allies begin slipping away. Most nobles refused to recognize his brother, but a few quietly began to switch sides. The Mazdakites had given Kawus a strong base of support, and Khosrau decided that he needed to take that support away. He invited Mazdak and his people to come to his palace without Kawus, promising to hear their demands. The invitation was a trap. As the Mazdakites entered his courtyard, Khosrau had them cut down. One story, which is probably just a story, but it goes to show how ruthless Khosrau was perceived to be, says that he planted their corpses upside down in his garden, and invited Mazdak to gaze upon these unique and beautiful trees. Then he had Mazdak hanged from the gallows. Now that Kawus no longer had his most powerful ally, he was easy prey. Khosrau captured him and dragged him in front of the priests. He offered to set Kawus free if he begged forgiveness in front of all the holy men at court. Kawus replied that he preferred death to humiliation, and Khosrau obliged. Then he hunted down every one of them.
Okay, so yeah, we had a little bit of sibling problems, but like he sorted it out rather quickly. That's at least he was decisive there. You'd think like, how does somebody do that to their brother or whatever? But like I guess from birth, a lot of these noble families, they're just kind of taught to be confrontational with one another, or they're incentivized to be just ruthless with one another. So it's not at all really that surprising.
Of Kawus' sons and executed them before they could even think of avenging their father or stealing the throne. It was at this point that Khosrau returned his attention to Justinian's envoys and informed them that he was now, without question, the Shah of Iran. Would they like to make peace with him now? Justinian decided that, yes, he very much would. He handed over 11,000 pounds of gold to pay for the defense of the Caucasian gates and withdrew his military base from Dara. But Khosrau would not forget or forgive this Roman emperor for failing to support his succession.
All right, so like I said, I think this is a 5-episode series. So we're about to get to and pass the middle point with episode 3. Let's see what the title is. The Immortal Soul. Okay, that doesn't tell me much, so I guess we'll just jump into it.
When Khosrau defeated Mazdak and put down his brother's rebellion, the priests gave him a new name, Anushirawan, the Immortal Soul. It was an honor that he intended.
Anushirawan. I've actually heard that term. Okay. I like when I hear things that sound vaguely familiar. This might come into, I don't know if, is that a title or is it like actually his name? I guess I'll find out. Anushirawan is definitely something that I've heard before, which makes me happy.
Upon coming into his own, Khosrau burst into a flurry of action nearly unparalleled in history. He reformed almost every aspect of the empire, trying to fix those broken systems that had nearly doomed his father's reign and guiding Iran into a new golden age. Both his and his father's successions had nearly been derailed by pressures on their army. It turns out that structuring your military as a single unified force means that it can only serve on one side of the empire at a time, and a single defeat, or even an overcommitment to a single border, could easily leave you scrambling for emergency funds to hire another army at the last minute.
This is like how I play Civ.
Expand and restructure his military, but to do that, he was gonna need money. His father, who had recognized this same issue, had long ago begun a property survey of the entire empire, cataloging what each citizen owned and what they could afford to pay. But a survey that long takes forever, so it wasn't complete until Khosrau's time. Khosrau made use of this immediately. Nice. He levied new taxes that demanded a fixed amount based on wealth, asking the richest citizens to pay the most. He also
what a novel idea!
Be paid with coin and not goods. He didn't need his farmers' perishable wheat. He needed gold. In the end, people ended up paying higher taxes than they used to, but their tax rate was now consistent, year after year. No more panicked emergency levies. And now, Khosrau could stockpile that non-perishable money for a rainy day. Next on the reform list was tax collection. For generations, the noble families had been responsible for both assessing and collecting taxes. But now that Kavad's land survey had made their assessments irrelevant, Khosrau delivered the killing blow by taking away their ability to collect taxes too. In their place, he created a new upper middle class called the Dagans and appointed them as tax collectors who answered only to Khosrau and the priests. The nobles could no longer lie about how much wealth their provinces generated, or
So, okay. I feel like he is consolidating power, but like there is some like practical influence that the people who are in the positions before sort of hold. And I don't know how he could completely invalidate any sort of long-term influence that they could have. Like, I feel like people like that often are like the threats looming underneath when it comes to internal conflict. So I'm a little nervous for Khosrau. I hope it works out for him, I guess, but I don't know.
Skim off the top to line their own pockets at the expense of the imperial treasury. Of course, the Dagans eventually became corrupt in their own right, but Khosrau had succeeded where it mattered most to him. He took power away from the noble families and doubled revenues for his empire. Now,
I assume it worked.
Khosrau could finally afford his military overhaul. He split it into 4 divisions, one for each corner of the empire. Each division would be led by its own general, and here Khosrau threw the noble families a bone by assigning them command. This was a sly power play too, though, because he made sure that the nobles were never given command of an army in their home region, so they could never consolidate power against him. And
that's genius. Okay, I was about to say, you're giving these people who might not be too fond of you right now their own little armies? Oh, that might not be a good idea. You don't want to give the sword to the people who may use it on you, but there's an extra layer to that. That's clever.
And where nobles had once been the only class allowed to serve as elite cavalry, Iran's most prestigious unit, Khosrau now allowed the Dagans into that exclusive club. Khosrau had learned well from his father's reign. Kavad had tried to go after the nobles directly by embracing Mazdak, a mistake that nearly cost him the empire. Khosrau, on the other hand, had won the nobles' favor by opposing Mazdak before quietly rooting out their other sources of power and replacing them with the Dagans, a loyal new social class of his own creation. The nobles still had influence, but not enough to threaten Khosrau the way Sukhra once threatened Kavad. And with these reforms, the empire flourished. Khosrau built walls at the 4 key entrances to his empire, making it easier to defend against invaders on all sides. He built a better network of roads, so his armies could travel more quickly, and that network enticed even more merchants from China and India along the prosperous Silk Road. This influx of trade brought not only wealth, but knowledge. Khosrau imported works on mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy from India on one side and Rome on the other, hoping to create a court of learning. Iran already had a long history of embracing education. 300 years before Khosrau, the founders of his own Sasanian dynasty had built a university complete with state-funded scholarships and the promise of safety and freedom to all who studied there. That was like the I suppose,
academic capital of the world in a lot of ways for a time, wasn't it? Like, I find that incredibly interesting. We gotta learn about that. We gotta learn about that stuff. I do have some videos I think that might cover around that time that I've been wanting to check out, but they've been kind of on the back burner for a while. So we'll see if we get around to it.
Promise lured refugee scholars from the Eastern Roman Empire, where Justinian had recently banned pagan teachings, leaving the classical Greek scholars from the famous school of Athens with nowhere to go. Khosrau welcomed them to his own university with open arms, and they declared him worthy of the title Plato's Philosopher King. The title was nice, but sticking it to Justinian, even nicer. Khosrau took a genuine personal interest in education. He attended a medical conference at the university with physicians from around the world, and after listening to them, he decided to add a hospital to his university. The library he built for it consisted of 259 rooms filled with row upon row of medical texts translated into every language. But even that incredible library was not enough for Khosrau. He wanted to gather all of the knowledge about Iran into one place. He urged his advisors to collect and write down their history going back to ancient times. Alas, this great collection would be lost several centuries later, but before it disappeared, it provided the basis for Iran's great national epic, the Shahnameh. And the Shahnameh's author came from Khosrau's own Dagan class, as the Dagans would become the empire's leading class of scholars. But Khosrau wasn't done yet. His next great challenge would be an attempt to restore the secret
after
text
Islamic
of
conquest.
Iran's Zoroastrian religion. Even today, Zoroastrianism is one of the world's oldest active religions, with roots dating back at least as far as the 5th century BCE, and probably a lot farther. The belief system taught by the prophet Zoroaster had originally been passed down through the oral tradition. At one point, those teachings were written down in a great collection known as the Avesta. But when Alexander the Great conquered Iran in 330 BCE, he had burned down the old Shah's palace, and the Avesta with it. The oral tradition was all that remained. But in the centuries since that fire, many of Iran's great Shahs had attempted to collect and re-record the Avesta from those oral accounts. Khosrau's predecessors had laid much of the groundwork, but he was determined to finish the job. He assigned his priests to review and rationalize their collection, organizing the scattered fragments into a master copy that set the standard for Orthodox faith. Khosrau became a mirror for cultured behavior that upper-class Iranians were expected to follow. Schools for the education of young noblemen began teaching the sciences as well as the courtly arts like poetry and music. And best of all,
This is like... I don't want to call it like an enlightenment, because that has some cultural baggage that is sort of unique to Western Europe. But this like age of academics, it is, I'm sure there's got to be a term for it, but it's kind of fascinating, and I look at it and it gives me like sort of Enlightenment academic vibes, I suppose.
Khosrau insisted that anybody who wanted respect in Iran become really, really good at board games. After visiting India in search of medical knowledge, one of Khosrau's university physicians had brought back the games chess and backgammon. Chess had been devised as a military strategy game, teaching players to manage an army in battle formation. Backgammon, on the other hand, quickly acquired new Iranian rules that reflected the random nature of fate in the Zoroastrian belief system. Together, these games taught important lessons about how to control what you can and accept what you can't. And it was through Iran and Khosrau's ever-active trading network with Rome that chess and backgammon traveled to the West and became the games we know today. All of these changes and reforms were the product of a lifetime for Khosrau, but he laid the foundation for them in the very first years of his reign. It was the perfect time. The Hephthalites were busy fending off Turks in the north. The Arabs had allied with Iran and created a buffer zone to the south, and the Romans, under Justinian, had signed a treaty known as the Eternal Peace. With so few enemies to threaten him, Khosrau seized the opportunity and proved himself worthy of the name Anushirawan, which Iranians still know him by today. But the peace which allowed Khosrau to launch his empire of reforms would soon come to an end. Beleaguered Ostrogoth messengers stumbled into Iran across a Roman border opened by the Treaty of Eternal Peace. They raced along the roads that Khosrau had recently rebuilt to beg for an audience with the Shah. And when the veils lifted to reveal Khosrau on his throne, the messengers spoke. Justinian has sent all of his armies to attack us in the west. Please, help us.
All right, we're gonna actually get some more Justinian action here, which, you know, you guys love Justinian so much, why don't you marry him? But, like, yeah, you know, we gotta get around to this. I'm excited to see where the action goes. Honestly, with extra history, so normally I don't care about military history. Extra history makes it kind of fun for me, just a little bit. I'm kind of cool with that. Like, military history, whatever it is. I don't study it personally. I don't find it that interesting, but it's kind of fun when they do it.
The truce signed by Khosrau and Justinian in 532. Okay,
this peas gag is kind of hilarious, but I think they're taking it several layers too far.
See, had no expiration date. This peace was meant to last forever. But after that nonsense the Romans had pulled with that barbarian adoption proposal, Khosrau knew better than to trust them.
Bar.
Justinian had been meddling in his affairs, and Khosrau had proof. His loyal Arabic ally to the south had sent Khosrau a copy of a letter he'd received from Justinian, promising him gold if he would switch to Justinian's side. Then a group of Turks had arrived in Khosrau's court, with another letter that they claimed Justinian had sent, telling them that Rome would be grateful if they invaded Iran and created some havoc. Khosrau sent copies of these letters back to Justinian and warned him that if this behavior continued, their treaty was over. But Justinian denied everything. Hey, K-Man, these letters aren't real. Chill out. Yet the hits kept on coming. Envoys from the...
I mean, you've gotta doubt that, right? Because, like, it would be rather easy to fake something like that. Where is the motivation? I don't know.
The Goths stumbled into Khosrau's
yeah, you can't just jump into
help against Romans who had been beating them up over in Italy. They said, "Do you really think that a man as greedy and ambitious as Justinian won't try to conquer your country as soon as he's done conquering ours?" They urged Khosrau to strike right now while the Romans were still tied down in the west. News of Justinian's abuses also trickled in from Lesser Armenia, where the Romans had begun demanding taxes so high that the Armenians rose in revolt. The first Roman general sent to quell them tried to turn them against each other, only to screw it up and get killed in the first major battle. The second Roman general lured the Armenians into a parley before treacherously killing their ambassador. The Armenians fled to Khosrau's court and begged him to help. Peace treaty or no, this had gotten out of hand. Khosrau asked a Zoroastrian fire temple to check the auspices for him, see if God would support him making war on the Romans. The fire temple said, yep. Which is no surprise. Historically, God generally tends to agree with kings, at least when they ask their priests nicely. And that was good, because with this, Khosrau could assure his court that he wasn't breaking a treaty. No. He was leading a holy war. See, throughout this entire period of peace, Khosrau had been getting ready for this. After that adoption insult and the wrench Justinian threw into his succession, are you kidding me? Khosrau was primed for revenge. But he wasn't just gonna beat Justinian. Oh, no. He was going to humiliate Justinian, and have himself a good old time doing it. Khosrau swept into Roman territory at the head of a giant army, signaling that the eternal peace had officially expired. Eternity, it turns out, is really just about 8 years long. But he had to move quickly because Justinian's army would not be stuck out in Italy forever, and fighting an army is way less fun than sacking an undefended countryside. So rather than taking the time to lay siege to every single town he came across, Khosrau gave them a simple choice. Just surrender and pay me a bribe, or I will kill every single one of you. One town chose to resist. After that, the other towns did not. Khosrau took that city bribe money and...
That's like, kind of the appeal of terror as a tactic. I just do whatever you can to make sure, like, nobody wants to fight you again. You have to maybe make one gruesome example, but, you know, from there, people will tend to, step back. That's what the pirates did. They would use such strong intimidation tactics that very often they could raid a ship without even having to fight. And people would just give up their goods because they know the alternative is worse.
And then used it to bribe Justinian's army. The soldiers appointed to the east had been complaining for years about how underpaid they were, and now here was the Shah of Iran offering them money and glory by the handful. Roman deserters poured into Khosrau's army. This lightning campaign through eastern Rome had one goal in sight: Antioch, the wealthiest and largest of Justinian's cities in the east. Ever since an earthquake struck just a few years prior, Justinian had poured vast amounts of gold into rebuilding and restoring its former glory. So naturally, when Khosrau swept into the city and they refused to pay his bribe, he knocked down every single building, except for the church, enslaved the inhabitants, and went on his way. Justinian was reeling, and now the quick capture of Antioch had him on the ropes. The Western troops he'd been counting on had been delayed by a stubborn general pursuing personal glory over in Rome. With no army coming to his aid and cities falling
religious war, free get out of peace card. I'm sorry, that kind of kills me. I just had to acknowledge that one.
Left and right, Justinian did the only thing he could. He sent envoys to beg for peace. The envoys told Khosrau that breaking their treaty was kind of a jerk move. What had Rome ever done to deserve such treachery? Khosrau showed them the letters Justinian had sent to his allies, trying to turn them against him. And the envoys were like, all right, yeah, that makes sense.
So
how about we give you a whole bunch of money, plus a nice big yearly tribute, if you will just knock it off and go away. Khosrau agreed, and sent them running back to Justinian. Now, the Romans believed that this new treaty began the moment Khosrau said yes, but it turns out, no. As far as Khosrau...
So who's the villain, Justinian or Khosrau? Well, I would say during these times, these are a bunch... world leaders that kind of play with the lives of their people for their own ego. Generally, there are no good guys when it comes to this sort of stuff. I would say is pretty fair. I would say that if you're asking who's being most antagonistic, I would say Justinian certainly started it. So I guess that's the if I were to say like who started it, Justinian from the looks of it, yes. And Khosrau is somewhat justified in like using a little bit of leverage here. But however, they did kind of, they established a piece which, you know, kind of undoes some of the stuff from before. You can't just keep bringing that up because like, hey, you agreed to a peace or whatever. But generally, I would say Khosrau is a little bit justified here.
Was concerned, the treaty wasn't official until the Romans paid up, and until that happened, he was gonna turn his campaign up to 11. Now, instead of capturing Roman cities, Khosrau began turning them into his own private resorts. He marched all the way to the Mediterranean Sea just so he could swim in its waters like the great Shahs of Iran's ancient past, sending Justinian a reminder of just how far Khosrau had come and how little Justinian could do to stop him. Then Khosrau took over a town and paid them to stage a special day of chariot races, just for him. And he happened to know that Justinian was a mega fan of the blue racing faction, so Khosrau
the racing factions. I remember this from the Justinian episode. Well, the Justinian series. There was like a ton of episodes. Okay.
Races to make sure that the Blues suffered an embarrassing loss to the rival Greens. He went
that's
on like
exciting.
This from town to town, demanding tribute from everybody and making Justinian look like a fool. He even took another swing at trying to capture Dara, that old sore spot between Iran and Rome, although once again Dara survived the attack. Then, finally, Justinian's stubborn general returned from the west with his main army, and Justinian was like, okay, screw your treaty, we are doing this. Now, Khosrau still had all the people he'd enslaved back at Antioch, and he'd kind of been counting on this treaty as an opportunity to sell them back to Justinian, but now he was stuck with them. After giving it some thought, he decided that he would take them back to Iran and build them a new town. Resettling captives from defeated cities was an old Iranian tradition. It was a great way to add a bunch of talented craftsmen to your population. Many Shahs before Khosrau had done exactly that. But our Khosrau, he liked to go above and beyond. He named his new city Antioch Khosrau. which translates to Khosrau's better Antioch. He recreated
what a
that city
Chad.
down to the smallest detail, from the layout of the streets to the number of rooms in each house. Even the building materials were the same. Then Khosrau freed the captive Antiochians and sent them to live in their new city. They were astounded. Khosrau asked one random citizen if he was happy to see his house again, and the man replied, "Oh yes, this looks exactly like it. Although, I do miss that mulberry tree that used to be in my front yard." The next morning, the man woke up to find a mulberry tree planted in his front yard. Khosrau's message to Justinian was clear.
So yeah, he really is a troll. That's what people have been, emphasizing about Khosrau in the chat this whole time. Like, hey, it's time to start trolling some Byzantines. And, okay, I see that.
Clear. Your soldiers choose me. Your towns choose me. And your people choose me. Get wrecked, son. Justinian now had his army back, but Khosrau still had him outnumbered. For a while, the Romans attempted small raiding expeditions, staying very...
Something not mentioned in either this series or the Justinian one, a lot of the instability of this period might be attributed to the volcano eruptions. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Just a geographic coincidence or just geographic tragedy causing a lot of the problems. That's kind of an interesting layer to it. I didn't know about that.
Very far away from any direct confrontation. That wouldn't do. Khosrau gathered his army and marched on Jerusalem, prepared to take the battle directly to Justinian's face. But while he was still marching to Antioch, a dark shadow crept into his army. Khosrau's men began to burst out in boils. Their skin decayed. They began to vomit blood. A plague from the land of Egypt had stretched out its hand and brushed both armies with decrepit fingers. The Romans shrank back into their cities. Khosrau and his army retreated north, looking for sanctuary, but the disease had already swept through his ranks. And worse,
we've talked about this plague before.
Its grip around Khosrau himself.
We've addressed this and the Justinian stuff as well. I don't remember if they mentioned Khosrau getting it, but here we go. And it's always interesting talking about historical plagues because we are in somewhat of a plague at the tail end of one, undoubtedly, but still in a plague of some kind.
Had been at the top of the world. Now he lay tossing and turning on a bed far from his royal palace, surrounded by an army that couldn't even stand, much less raise a sword. And as word of Khosrau's illness traveled home, it reached the ears of his son, Anushzad. Anushzad had been locked in prison. Not the Fortress of Oblivion, there were too many kebab-shaped holes in that particular jail. No, a different prison just outside Ctesiphon. The young man had been caught getting busy with some of Khosrau's wives, and was locked away as punishment.
Some of them? Like,
briefly.
Like he managed to get busy with multiple wives? I mean, I know I'm not doubting that Khosrau had multiple wives, but this individual managed to get more than one of them?
It turns out that jailbreaking skills ran in the family. Just like the Mazdakites had flocked to Kawus a decade prior, Christians in Khosrau's court began flocking to his Christian son, Anushzad. But here, Khosrau's reform efforts came to his rescue. Even though the army he'd led against Rome was now devastated by plague, he still had plenty of loyal soldiers serving back home. When one of them brought word of Anushzad's rebellion, Khosrau sent the man back with two objectives: kill the Christians, and capture my son. The fight was bloody. Khosrau's generals quickly overpowered Anushzad, who had little military experience, but the young man refused to be captured. He died fighting alongside his followers, who were quickly rounded up and put to the sword. Khosrau prided himself on his open-mindedness, and once boasted that he had not rejected anyone for belonging to a different religion or people. But while he continued to defend Christianity's right to exist within his empire, he began to view certain Christians as political threats. Those who had supported Anushzad seemed to demand a ruler who shared their faith, and already Khosrau had seen...
So I always bring things back to where I live because I view history very much through my own lens. That's just kind of how we view history. Despite our attempts to get into other people's heads as best as possible, we're stuck with our own lens. in a lot of ways. But I'd like to bring this stuff back to my state's history. We have a reputation of being very open to other religions. However, there was always exceptions. We ended up having big problems with Quakers on occasion, because some Quakers were, along with their religion came like more likeliness that they would make these big, grand, moral and political statements and make these like very strange demonstrations in public that, like, independently of them just being a different religion, caused people to kind of turn against them in an otherwise relatively tolerant place. So with Khosrau, I am not going to be able to perfectly judge like what level of cynicism he's coming at this with, or how genuinely these people may be a threat to him, but I would assume there's probably at least a small degree of cynicism there. But I don't know.
Zod seemed to demand a ruler who shared their faith, and already Khosrau had seen 2 territories on his western border try to leave his empire to join Christian Rome. The political power of Christianity threatened to overwhelm Iran, and Khosrau had to stop it. Plague had forced him to make peace with Justinian, but that very peace allowed him to turn his attention toward Justinian's allies. Christians from Ethiopia had crossed over into Yemen decades before, and during the war, Justinian had tried to convince them to attack Iran across the Persian Gulf. They would have done it too if they didn't have so many of their own civil war issues to deal with. Khosrau seized this opportunity. He marched his army into Yemen, pushed back the Ethiopians, and installed a loyal Arabic king. In a single move, he not only managed to push Justinian's allies out of the region and replace them with his own, but he also locked down the last sea routes to India. Now, both Rome and Africa would have to go through his ports and pay his taxes.
Oh shoot, what up?
Spices, silks, and teas from the east. Unfortunately, Khosrau's control of the eastern trade soon put him at odds with his own allies. You remember those Hephthalites who killed Khosrau's grandfather? Kavad had eventually sought revenge for that offense by waging several wars against them, after using their help and technology to secure his own throne, of course. But, as always, it fell to Khosrau to finish the job. He teamed up with the Northern Turks to attack the Hephthalites from multiple directions, and together they wiped the Hephthalite Empire off the face of the earth. Khosrau took a chunk out of their old southern territory.
Not as bad as a plague, as bad a plague as back then. I don't know. I might be able to argue that COVID might have been worse. If you're just talking about like proportion of people it takes out, it might be a different, like, I don't have the data in front of me right now, but COVID's body count like is really high. I don't know. I could reasonably make an argument that it's worse now than back then, but like also there's a lot of elements that are better, like medical science is generally better, and the fact that there's more people would mean that more people would end up getting it, and maybe you should judge it by compared to like the amount of people who were alive at the time and like what percentage of people ended up suffering from it. Depends on how you look at it, I suppose, the degree of how bad the plague was.
And left the rest to the Turks so they could form their own new kingdom in the north. The Turks settled right in and started trading with merchants from the Silk Road. They wanted to follow Iran's lead and sell their new luxury goods to the Romans at a huge markup. But to get to Rome, they would have to go through Iran. They naturally assumed that their old ally Khosrau would be cool about this and give them a lower tax rate. But Khosrau did not be cool. He had just secured the last few silk trade routes for his empire. Why would he want to give up that monopoly? So he sent the Turks away empty-handed. And naturally, they were furious. But the Turks had learned a few tricks during their time allied with Khosrau. They sent a message to Rome, proposing that the two of them team up to form a pincer around Iran, exactly like Khosrau had urged them to do to the Hephthalites. Now, Justinian had passed away at this point and left the throne to his nephew, Justin II, and Rome wasn't doing so hot. All of the looming problems of Justinian's grand and ambitious reign had collapsed onto his nephew. The
I think Justinian is often judged for what happened in his time, but I think leaders do need to be judged a little bit more for what happens like a little bit after their time as well, because often you don't see the fallout of somebody's reign until after the fact, which is why a lot of presidents are looked at as all right when you just look at their time, but when you see like the consequences of their action as they play out over the next following decades, other presidents end up getting blamed for it, even though like it's kind of the legacy of another person. So like I think viewing this as like oh Justinian, what he was doing was not would not have been sustainable, and there are consequences for how he chose to lead in his own time that carry on into the next time, though the leaders of the time are also very much responsible for it. It's good to view it in like a holistic way.
Treasury was empty, the army was stretched thin, and Justin was just not the same savvy operator his uncle had been. Justin resented the annual tribute that Justinian had agreed to pay Iran for guarding the Caucasian gates, and destroying Iran seemed like the best solution, which maybe it would have been if he'd had a competent army, or money, or any advantage at all, really. The one advantage he'd expected to have didn't materialize. The Turks never got their army together to support Rome's attack. But Justin wanted this war now, and Khosrau's growing distrust of the Christians in his empire soon provoked it. In an effort to prevent any more of his border territories from switching sides, Khosrau sent an administrator to the Christian province of Greater Armenia with orders to strengthen Zoroastrian worship there. Despite the objections of the Armenians, who had long ago been promised religious freedom, Khosrau's official built a new Zoroastrian fire temple. The Armenians reached out to Justin, asking if he would support them switching sides, and of course he would. So they launched their war in the most dramatic way possible. The Armenians killed Khosrau's official, and Justin immediately halted his tribute to Iran. Khosrau cracked his knuckles at this, and replied, "All right, kiddo, let me show you why your uncle learned never to mess with me." Once again, the armies of Iran swept into eastern Rome. Khosrau relished this chance to finish what he'd started 30 years ago, and despite being...
The cheese in these jokes, it's just too cheesy for me sometimes. The relish.
70 years old now, he led the armies himself. They swept up towns along the border, while Justin's troops languished in a siege in an Armenian city.
And yeah, I know, it's probably better to use the percentage when gauging how bad a plague is. I'm just being a contrarian.
Not far from Dara. Furious that his army had accomplished so little while Iran had conquered so much, Justin abruptly fired his general and left his troops in a panic. They abandoned the siege and fled, leaving their weapons and equipment behind. Khosrau sauntered over to the abandoned war camp, picked up those weapons with a "thank you very much," and set off to conquer Dara. It had been 72 years since the Romans built that fort in violation of the treaty they once had with Iran, and to Khosrau that meant that it was well past time that Dara fell. He spared no expense. He diverted an entire river and cut all of the aqueducts to break the city's water supply. Then he carved rocks from the mountains themselves to build ramparts that would let his troops storm over the wall. Dara, that monument to Roman treachery and stubborn defiance, finally fell. When Justin heard about this loss, it broke him. He descended into madness, literally snapping at the attendants who tried to nurse him back to health. During a rare moment of lucidity, Justin's wife, Sophia, convinced him to appoint his general Tiberius as co-emperor. She also negotiated a short truce with Khosrau and bought Rome time to stabilize. In return,
that's nice.
Khosrau got to have free reign in Armenia, which the truce now left unprotected. He quickly moved his army over there and began sacking cities, while Tiberius struggled to put his
Khosrau
army
was a
back together.
Chad.
It took 5 years, but he did it. He was finally ready to take on Khosrau. The old Shah was so preoccupied leading his troops over in Armenia that this newly rejuvenated Roman force caught him by surprise. They circled his camp at night and forced him to flee, abandoning his pavilion and all of the riches he'd gathered. His retreat path led across a river, but while Khosrau crossed safely on the back of an elephant, many of his troops were swept away.
Oh yeah, they used elephants.
Wreaking havoc and setting fire to the towns on the other side of the river did he manage to throw off the Roman pursuit and escape to the safety of Iranian land. The shame of this defeat compelled Khosrau to pass a new law, forbidding future shahs from leading armies into battle. He returned to Ctesiphon and let his generals take the lead. The excited Roman generals pushed their advantage,
a little old
but
for this
they
anyway.
pushed too far, handing an easy victory back to Iran that stabilized the war. Both sides sought peace at this point. An embassy from Tiberias was on its way to Iran for approval of the final terms, but before it even reached Ctesiphon, Khosrau died of old age. Khosrau had built upon the groundwork laid by his father to remake an empire and create an Iranian golden age. But that golden age ended with him. His son rejected the peace terms with Rome and went back to war. He quarreled with the Arabic allies who had so long guarded Iran's southern border. The Turks saw this long-awaited opportunity and struck at his overextended armies. In the end, even the court turned against Khosrau's son and overthrew him. In the decades that followed, the Sasanian dynasty struggled to maintain the vast army Khosrau had built. They struggled to support the centers of learning Khosrau had cherished. And ultimately, they fell. Not to Rome, and not to Christianity, but to the Muslims, a new force.
Another guy who should probably be judged not just for what he did in his time, but what happened afterwards. Like, did he build something that was sustainable? I think that's incredibly important, and I guess if you're gonna draw parallels with him and Justinian, you find nothing better.
That rose up from the south. And here, perhaps, Khosrau found his legacy. Because while his descendants had failed to keep the empire together, the Muslims studied his way of governing Iran and adopted it. They admired his university and brought its wisdom back with them to Baghdad. But
hey, House of Baghdad! House of Baghdad! I mean, House of Wisdom in Baghdad! Yeah, that thing. Where all the smart people go and do the smart things. Okay, that was just fantastic. That was one of the more fun ones since the Justinian times. Like, that's actually, that was incredible. He's an interesting dude. It's fun being able to explore somebody from such a very different place from what I'm used to. Iran, or Persia in general, is something that, like, its importance is undoubtable, and I have not studied it all that much, so anytime I get the opportunity to learn about it, it's like a whole new world, and it's a ton of fun.